welcome back to Elite Literary Book Group. I'm Rachel Beck, and I'm going to go through another AP question today, but I'm going to use Mayor of Casterbridge, which I don't think I've ever talked about except for in my Jude the Obscure lecture. I allude to it because it's the same author, Thomas Hardy, and Thomas Hardy is not an easy read. It's Victorian literature. I'd say it's probably even a little bit denser than Dickens. But that also means that it's richer in terms of what you could do with your essays, you know. So what I would normally focus on with Mayor of Casterbridge is the question about a tragic hero. And I may do another video just to go more in depth with that. But I have a video on King Lear and the Tragic Hero in case you want to look at that. If you're going to take the AP test, you should be familiar with the Tragic Hero. But I'm going to mention a little bit, but that's not really the focus of this question. So if you're curious about that, watch the King Lear one. Okay, so this question is, some works of literature focus on the conflict that can arise when characters of different generations respond to the same situation. Select a novel or play in which such contrasting perspectives play a pivotal role. Then write a well-organized essay which you analyze how the opposing viewpoints and values of the older and younger characters contribute to the meaning of the work as a whole. And this was in 2013. I thought it was kind of interesting because today with social media, there's a lot more discussion about the generations and their differences and their struggle. When I was young, we were just sort of unaware so much. I mean, you knew your different character types, but you didn't really see them in a cluster where you could say, these people always say this, or these people are always doing this. And, you know, in pop culture, it's just, you know, it's sort of a slight fun thing in a way. It's funny to see them on Twitter or something like that. Where it gets a little bit more serious is when you're talking like politics. And people really start to grab onto their beliefs. I picked Mayor of Casterbridge for this because Henchard, who's also the tragic hero, is in kind of a rival position with a younger, more attractive in a way, innovative guy who's coming from, I'm not sure where exactly, I think Scotland. And he comes as a worker who Henchard ends up just loving and hiring. And by the end of the story, Henchard is working for Farfrae, the guy that he took under his wing. And it was, you know, his company, his big deal. But because Farfrae could come in with new ideas and was more innovative, he ends up taking over. So let me back up and just talk about what happens with Henchard in the beginning, because this is where you see the tragic characters of Henchard. Henchard, in the very beginning, he gets drunk. He's at a fair with his wife and little infant daughter, and for no particular reason at all, he decides to sell his wife. Just anybody want to take her? She's for sale. Now, he's doing this because he's drunk. Mainly, he doesn't really even like want the money or really want to get rid of the wife. He just does it because he's stupid. He does stupid things all through the novel. And so she goes off with this other guy, the sailor, and says, you know what? I'm done. I'm going to go off with him and leave you, and you're going to regret this. And he's, you know, okay, whatever. The next day he sobers up and he thinks, oh my God, what did I just do? I just sold my wife. I got to get out of here. I got to start a new life. And with a tragic hero, Hinchard is not a bad person. Tragic heroes are not villains. They're not just bad people. But the term for it is like harmatia. They miss the mark. Here's the mark, and they're just always just right a little bit to the left or the right. They're never on target. And so, but it's such a bad mistake. It's like a curse. And it's going to follow him because, of course, I mean, this was even incredible when readers read this. I mean, it's incredible for us, but I mean, imagine what it was like for them in the 19th century. Who does that? Who comes up with that? Thomas Hardy, because it's going to set things in motion for the tragic hero. And the thing about the tragic hero is he's tragic, but he's also at the mercy of the wills of fate. Hinchard says, when he becomes very lonely in his life, some of it is my fault and some of it is just misfortune. And he's right. If you look at Romeo and Juliet, a lot of things that don't go right when they don't get messages and so forth is just fate. It's not their fault. But for some reason, like in King Lear, he says, the gods are against me. And King Lear also says something like, I'm a man more sinned against than sinning. Today, we would probably look at Hinchard and his reaction the next morning almost as someone who's very narcissistic. Because he blames his wife, Susan, in a way. How could she be so simple-minded as to take me for my word? Sound familiar? I did this, I'm to blame, but she should have known better. She should have not actually left and let herself be sold to the sailor and take my daughter, no less. But she does. And Hinchard makes a vow, which is kind of also important about his character as like an old school guy. He makes a vow. He says, I am never, or no, I'm going to say never, I won't drink for 20 years. And he keeps that vow, which is kind of remarkable because most people with a drinking problem would need a little more help, like AA or something. No, he just needs to make a vow. That's the kind of guy he is. He's very old-fashioned. He is almost like a cowboy type. He is part of the landscape. And Farfrae, who comes into the picture, is like this itinerant wanderer, kind of free spirit. He doesn't really attach to anything. He's a great person, but he doesn't quite have the depth that Hinchard has. He doesn't feel as strongly as Hinchard does. And while his wife is gone, he actually does really well for himself. It's like the wheels of fate turn in his favor. He actually becomes mayor. So here he is. He's got this dark secret, but he's mayor. He's accomplished something that he could never have accomplished, had he stayed where he was. But he makes this mistake of letting Farfrae into his life. He loves him. He's very passionate about them. And this is where Hardy, one of the reasons I wanted to use this book is because Hardy kind of parallels the story of Hinchard and Farfrae with the story of the Old Testament of Saul and David. Saul in the beginning loved David. David would play the harp for his, maybe he had migraines or something, would soothe him. The very first time Hinchard meets Farfrae, he hears him sing. He's drawn to his music, and everyone is drawn to Farfrae in this town. But what happens is he lets Farfrae have too much. He puts way too much trust in him. And eventually, Farfrae is going to be calling the shots because he's a lot smarter than Hinchard. Meantime, the wife comes back. She says, my husband died, the sailor died at sea. Here's Elizabeth Jane, your daughter, remember the infant? And Hinchard's in a bad situation because he had been seeing this other woman, and now he can't see her. And so he has to tell Lucetta, I can't see you anymore. I'm sorry. But remember that vow. I mean, this is the kind of man who's going to go back to his wife and act like nothing ever happened. Forget how in love he is with this other woman. Well, guess what? Farfrae goes for the woman. There's a quote when Farfrae first shows up. I'm going to read real quick. It says, "Casterbridge had sentiment. Casterbridge had romance. But this stranger's sentiment was of differing quality. Or rather, perhaps, the difference was mainly superficial. He was to them like a poet of new school who takes his contemporaries by storm, who is not really new, but is first to articulate what all of his listeners have felt." So this is, in today's world, this struggle, just to get to like, okay, so what does all this mean? Well, it's kind of a familiar story about, you have an older gentleman and a younger guy. Henchard is stuck in his ways. Farfrae is revolutionizing farming. He literally comes up with something, and it's like this drill of being able to sow the seeds more efficiently. And Elizabeth Jean, the daughter, sees it and says, "The romance of the sower is gone for good." Now, if you know the parable of the sower, it's where the seeds fell. Okay, some are going to fall on rocks, some are going to fall on good soil, but it's kind of like this, you don't know. It's just where these seeds fall and whether they're going to, take root or not. And that's significant because also Hardy says in the beginning when he's explaining Henchard, he says, "But character is fate." Think about that. Character is fate. You can't really control so much of who you are going to be. Because let's just put it this way. If I could be an engineer and make a lot of money, I would do that. Or doctor or something. But I can only seem to use the right side of my brain. And, in today's world, here I am talking about literature. Sometimes I wonder, why am I doing this? Who is, unless you're like me, which is, probably not a lot of people, let's just face it, that this is something that might go away. Artificial intelligence is like right there. What am I going to do? Or what are the English majors like me, the people who, we've already faced this, which is why I'm not in a school right now, because I've tried that, and they didn't want me to teach literature, so I left. They just want them to, read Harry Potter, things that are enjoyable. I can't fight with that anymore, because I'm getting too old to fight. They're just seeing me as an old teacher. We'll just bring in these young people. This is what happens. This is something similar happened to my dad when he was a very successful businessman until he was about 60. And then he got laid off, and he could hardly find another job, even though he was really well paid. But that was kind of the problem. He was very qualified. But when you try to go back into that world, you don't fit in anymore. And Henchard is finding that about himself. As things are changing, industrializing, he is also getting older. And so it's not just that these other, forces are after you. Nature itself is not on your side. So what then do we make of this as we get to the meaning of the work as a whole? Well, because Henchard is kind of an idiot at times, he finds out he only kind of makes things worse for him. He almost kills Farfrae in one scene. He's so mad at him, and then I think he tells him he loves him. Farfrae actually is very generous in letting Henchard work for him later on, and the woman dies, and Farfrae goes for his daughter, who we find out actually isn't his daughter. His real daughter died. And guess what? Her father's back, and he wants to see his daughter. And Henchard is finding all this out, but he's still trying to control this world that he's so used to thinking he can control the fates. He doesn't want to lose Elizabeth as his daughter. It's the only person in his life. And then when her father comes back, he lies to the father and says, oh, she died. Now, he knows this is going to come back to him. Everything is going to come back to him. He's like he's cursed himself. And towards the end, Hardy writes about Henchard. He's looking at almost like comparing him to this wasteland. And it says, the whole land ahead of him was as darkness itself. There was nothing to come, nothing to wait for. Yet in the natural course of life, he might possibly have to linger on earth another 30 or 40 years, scoffed at best pitied. And I really like it. It's a couple of times he says that Henchard is pitied. People pity narcissistic people all the time. It's like one of their seductive powers is they treat you horribly and then you feel sorry for them. Because it really, they are insecure people, and they end up being very lonely people. And Henchard finds himself alone. So Hardy is, of course, this is a tragedy, but Hardy is also accused of being a very pessimistic person. I tend to think he's a very realistic person. But if I had to try to connect all this with, the generational problems, I would have to put in my claim, in my thesis, that the older generation is going to lose because everything is against them. It's like nature itself is against them. And they have to pass on. And they really wouldn't be able to endure the world when you look back. In your life is a certain way. Like I grew up in Tyler, and my grandmother lived there forever. I always went to her house, and it was beautiful backyard with woods and stuff. And towards the end of her life, they started building a Walmart in the back of the house. When I go back to Tyler, with the death of my grandmother, it's almost like the death of a town. I don't recognize it anymore. I almost don't recognize my home. And so that's what I'm saying with the argument as the work as a whole, is that the older generation really doesn't have a choice. That they die. They die, but a culture dies with them. And then a new one is born. So at any rate, I know that's a lot. It's a heavy book. But if you're interested in Thomas Hardy, I have Jude the Obscure, which is even more complicated than this book. This book is actually easier to read, and you can do a lot with it on the AP test. But I'll put the links below for the blog and the King Lear video as well. All right, thanks for watching.